Welcome to Standard Deviation.
Hi, Kevin.
Hello, Ciara. How's it going?
All right.
And hello to our listeners. Hello from the zombie apocalypse of 2020. What is today's date? March 21st or 2nd?
The 20th.
March 20th, 2020, in the midst of the coronavirus lockdown.
So, for those of you who religiously listen to our podcast, and I know there are
It's just me.
literally hundreds of thousands of you, so the last few episodes we recorded, like, I guess a month ago?
Yeah, about that.
Because I was traveling. I went to Bali, and then I went to Australia. And so we pre-recorded those podcasts. So our apologies for talking about shit that really didn't matter last week. I think the big topic was that dwarf kid that was being bullied.
Yeah.
Which seems like forever ago now.
Yeah, and I mean, to be fair, we don't always do topical episodes. We usually don't. But, if you care, then sorry, I guess.
I don't know. It just bothers me because, there's literally, this thing that's happening that's far more important than anything else.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. Given the situation and assuming that the world survives and anyone is listening to this in the future, months or years from now, maybe even millennia from now, or aliens, if aliens are listening and for some reason this is the only podcast that you listen to, then you don't know. But yeah, there's a flu variant going around. I think it's a flu variant. Coronavirus, one of many coronaviruses, so named because the cells under a microscope have a circle, sort of like a halo crown around them. And it's unclear right now. The data is still coming in and being analyzed, and it's safe to say that the data are not accurate. But it appears to be probably more lethal than the common flu.
Oh, I got some data for you. We'll get there.
Yeah, that'll be fun.
I think you're jumping ahead here.
I'll finish my sentence. It appears to be probably more lethal than the common flu. The transmission is somewhat unknown, but the important thing is that there are a lot of state level and government level lockdowns and quarantines happening.
Right. The transmission rate is on average one person who gets a person who's infected on average infects 2 to 2.5 people.
Yeah, I don't know though in comparison to other, flus.
Well, I'll get into some data on that in a second here, but
let's see who's running the show.
Well, yeah, I have a lot of things I want to some backup information, but I thought we could talk about so it's March 20th, and just the past week, things have just escalated very rapidly. I was not taking this seriously at all when I was in Australia. I got back on the 10th. I was sitting at a hotel in the middle of downtown where there were just crowds from a mall just outside, and I went out in those crowds every day. Every day I went out in those crowds, and we had our final screening of Use Me, which we had a whole theater full of people for that.
Ciara's movie.
And when it wasn't until actually the plane ride back home that I started listening to Sam Harris's podcast about it and Joe Rogan's podcast about it. And it was kind of eerie because I was taking this seriously while in the exact spot I really shouldn't have been, which was an airport and a couple flights. Luckily, I flew in from Sydney to Honolulu, so I think there's probably worse routes I could have taken, but the moment I got home, I decided that I wasn't going to leave the house unless absolutely necessary. I kind of figured I probably got it, and I was just waiting out the first 4 days, just because they say the first 3 to 5 days you're asymptomatic but contagious. So I was waiting that out. It's been a week and a half, and I haven't felt sick or anything, so I don't think I got it. I don't think you have it, but we are quarantining. Quarantining, is that a word?
Probably.
All right. We're quarantining right now. Although you told me that technically it's not quarantine unless you're sick.
I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure quarantine is when you find somebody who's sick and isolate them, whereas containment or probably some other things are when you find people who aren't sick and isolate them.
Maybe that's why people are saying self-isolation instead.
Makes sense. But I mean, in the modern age, especially in the English language, it seems that however people are using a word, that's just what it means. And ultimately, words are for communication, so whatever.
Yeah. So I don't know. Those past week and a half has been really weird because I feel like you were taking it seriously before I was, I would say.
Well, yeah, I asked you when you were still in Australia. I asked you basically like, what do you think? And you said something like you don't personally expect to get super sick or die, but it seems like a big deal, and that's still accurate, and that's how I felt. But the details maybe were different. Yeah.
No, I mean, you were showing me things like Tim Ferriss was saying, and my gut instinct at the time, for whatever that's worth, was that I think maybe Tim Ferriss is being a little overly paranoid. I don't think it's going to be that bad. And even kind of when I was listening to Sam Harris's podcast, he starts out by saying, like, we need to social distance now. It is officially rude to shake anyone's hand or hug them or anything like that.
The time for hugs and handshakes is over, is what he said.
Yeah, and that this is their next 9/11. And I was like, okay, I officially take this more seriously than I was, but I think he's still, like, being a little bit dramatic. Yeah, I don't think he is at this point. And I spent some time trying to convince my friends to stay the fuck home. There was, like, this period where everyone was pouty because, like, their plans were being canceled, and that was very, like, annoying and shallow to me. And now I feel like I'm not trying to, like, pat myself on the back or anything. I'm like, I need it before anyone else. But, like, I felt like a little bit ahead of the curve amongst people I knew. And now I see them going through what I went through, where it's like, there's hitting them that, like, oh, this is serious. And, like, my grandma might die and I'm going to lose my job. And our economy is going to get flushed down the toilet. And
yeah, I mean,
scary.
I'm thinking 2 decades ahead, and, like, I don't want to sound too crazy, and I certainly don't want to scaremonger. So everybody who's listening, if you don't know me from listening before, you can't trust anything I say. So just for the record,
just shut this off now.
Having said that, I'm looking at various possible outcomes. I mean, it's possible that a year from now there will be very little societal change left over from this, and it's also possible that a year from now there will be armed conflicts leading to World War III. Based on the destabilization, two things: the destabilization of the economy is one, and then the other being whatever the government does next, which could include things like attempts to restrict free speech, given that the media is admittedly quite irresponsible with this kind of thing. Anyway, the point is there are lots of things that could happen. I'm focused more on the short term, like what do we need to do today, tomorrow, and next month. But yeah, it's interesting.
So, like, okay, so I want to read you a thread that came up just 3 days ago, I guess, which is like 3 weeks in virus time. Because one of the main things I wanted to talk about on this podcast is like, okay, everyone seems to be taking it seriously. I mean, I'm sure there's still jackasses that aren't, but for the most part, like, it seems like the overwhelming majority is taking it more seriously, supporting, like, social distancing. So we're all inside. Now what? Like, what's the plan now? And I'm just going to read this thread because it gives some more context to it. It's this guy summarizing this study that just came out from Imperial College. This came out,
which is in the UK.
Yeah, March 16th. Okay, so I'll just read it verbatim. We can now read the Imperial College report on the COVID-19 that led to extreme measures we've seen in the U.S. in the past week. Read it. It's terrifying. I'll offer a summary in this thread. Please correct me if I got anything wrong. The Imperial College team plugged infection and death rates from China, Korea, Italy into an epidemic modeling software and ran a simulation. What happens if the U.S. does absolutely nothing, if we treat COVID-19 like the flu, go about our business, and let the virus take its course? Here's what would happen. 80% of Americans would get the disease. 0.9% of them would die. Between 4 and 8% of all Americans over the age of 70 would die. 2.2 million Americans would die from the virus itself. It gets worse. People with severe COVID-19 need to be put on ventilators. 50% of those on ventilators still die, but the other 50% live. But in an unmitigated epidemic, the need for ventilators would be 30 times the number available in the U.S. Nearly 100% of these patients will die. So the actual death toll from the virus would be closer to 4 million Americans. In the span of 3 months, 8 to 15% of all Americans over 70 would die. How many is 4 million people? It's Americans. It's more Americans than have died in all at once from anything ever. It's the population of Los Angeles. It's 4 times the number of Americans who died in the Civil War, on both sides combined. It's 2/3 as many people that died in the Holocaust. Americans make up 4.4% of the world's population. If we extrapolate these numbers to the rest of the world, this gives us 90 million deaths globally from COVID-19 in 3 to 6 months. That's 15 Holocausts, 1.5 times as many people died in all of World War II. Now, of course, countries won't be standing by doing nothing, so the Imperial College ran the numbers again, this time assuming a mitigation strategy. All symptomatic cases in the U.S. in isolation. Families of those cases quarantined. All Americans over 70 social distancing. This mitigation strategy is what you've seen a lot of people talking about when they say that they should flatten the curve. Try to slow down the spread of disease to the people most likely to die from it to avoid overwhelming the hospitals. And it does flatten the curve, but not nearly enough. The death rate from the disease is cut in half, but it still kills 1.1 million Americans all by itself. The peak need for ventilators falls by 2/3, but it's still exceeding the number of ventilators in the U.S. by 8 times. That leaves the actual death toll in the U.S. right around 2 million deaths. That's the population of Houston, 2 civil wars, 1/3 of the Holocaust. Globally, 45 million people die. That's 7.5 Holocausts, 3/4 of a world war. This is really dark analogies. That's what happens when we rely on mitigation and common sense. Finally, the Imperial College ran the numbers again, assuming suppression strategy. Isolate symptomatic cases, quarantine their family members, social distancing for the whole population, all public gatherings / most workplaces shut down, schools and universities close. Suppression works. The death rate in the U.S. peaks at 3 weeks from now at a few thousand deaths. Then it goes down. We hit, but we don't exceed the number of available ventilators. The nightmarish death tolls from the rest of the study disappear. But here's the catch. If we ever relax suppression before a vaccine is administered to the entire population, COVID-19 comes right back and kills millions of Americans in a few months, the same as before. After the first suppression period ends in July, we could probably lift restrictions for a month, followed by 2 months of suppression in a repeating pattern without triggering an outbreak or overwhelming the ventilator supply. Staggering breaks by city could do it a bit better. But we simply cannot ever allow the virus to spread throughout the entire population in the way other viruses do because it's just too deadly. If lots of people we know end up getting COVID-19, it means millions of Americans are dying. It simply can't be allowed to happen. How quickly will a vaccine get here? Last week, 3 separate research teams announced that they developed vaccines. Yesterday, one of them, with FDA approval, injected its vaccine into a live person without waiting for animal testing. This is an extreme measure, but it's necessary. Now, though, they have to monitor the subject for 14 months to make sure the vaccine is safe. This part can't be rushed. If you're going to inoculate all humans, you have to make absolutely sure the vaccine itself won't kill them. It probably won't, but you have to be sure. Assuming the vaccine is safe and effective, it will take several months to produce enough to inoculate the global population. For this reason, the Imperial College team estimated it will take about 18 months until a vaccine is available. That's most of it.
There's more, but you're stopping there.
Yeah, I'm going to stop there because that's kind of, like, that's what I've been thinking about the last few days is, like, I don't think people realize how long we have to do this.
So,
like, we have to isolate, according to this, until we get a vaccine, which won't be for, like, another year and a half. Do you want me to keep reading it?
Yeah, just go ahead and finish it.
Okay. 18 months. Okay. During those 18 months, things are going to get very difficult and very scary. Our economy and society will be disrupted in profound ways. And if suppression actually works, it will feel like we're doing all this for nothing because infection death rates will remain low. It's easy to get people to come together in a common sacrifice in the middle of a war. It's very hard to get them to do so in a pandemic that looks invisible precisely because suppression methods are working. But that's exactly what we're going to have to do. And then he made a couple corrections. Do you want me to read the corrections?
Yep.
A couple of clarifications, corrections. An error on my end. 45 million global deaths would be the most from a pandemic since the Spanish flu in 1918, not since the Middle Ages. Apologies for my mistake. The Holocaust can refer to the 6 million Jews killed by Hitler. That's how I used it here. For everyone he killed, about 17 million total.
Or everyone he killed.
Oh, or everyone he killed. Thank you. Number 3, World War II lasted 6 years in Europe, but 12 years in Asia if you treat the invasion of Manchuria as a starting point, which most do.
Okay. And who is this guy? His name is Jeremy C. Young.
Jeremy C. Young.
It's on Twitter. We're reading this.
Assistant Professor of History
at Dixie State, Director of DSU Politics, author of The Age of Charisma.
So he's not responsible for this study. He was just summarizing it.
Yeah, I'm just curious, who he is.
Sure.
And Imperial College, I think that refers to Imperial College of London,
Yeah.
which has name recognition. I don't know anything about it. Okay, so...
But I've heard people talking about this study a bit. It's kind of been circulating.
Let's see. So a footnote about death rate, that's something that tends to be fluctuating a lot, but I have been hearing consistently that it's probably at least about 0.9% up to maybe 3. So that sounds legit. Without knowing anything about this data, or this was also 3 days ago, so
4 days ago.
4 days ago. And I do want to just reiterate what you said. The rate that things are changing, I have never seen anything remotely like this. Last night, it occurred to me that I was surprised that we hadn't seen photos of the military entering cities yet. And this morning when I woke up, they were.
Yeah, in New Orleans.
Yeah, and I was actually kind of proud of myself for predicting that and expecting at least 2 days to 2 weeks before it happened. And it was a couple hours. Anyway, so assuming that these data are correct, I think the big question is, it raises a question about the role of governments. So the responsible thing, assuming that it's feasible, would be a 1 to 2 year quarantine of the entire country, it sounds like. Is that your interpretation as well?
Pretty much, yeah.
So then the question is, assuming that's correct, is that even going to be what the government tries to do? Because there's probably people right now arguing about this, some saying it's impossible or it would lead to revolution or something. If they do try, the question of whether it would work or not is very much a matter of execution. If they don't try, it'll be the largest scandal in the history of the United States, at least because it would lead to a lot of death. I think they are going to try, and I have no idea if it'll work or not. I'll have to think about that more.
Yeah, I mean, no one really knows how this is going to pan out. We've never experienced this before.
So let's try to put this in concrete terms. It sounds like what they were just saying is that, like, what they're talking about is keeping people in their homes, either for a year or two, or letting people out every couple months.
Yeah.
To help flatten that curve and not overload the system. That's a big deal.
Yeah, it's a huge deal. I don't know if we can pull it off either. I mean, that's like, what is that going to do to like a generation of kids that go to school?
Yeah, well, I mean, school is stupid, so they can learn from home.
I saw this one article, I think Chris Ryan posted it, and it was about how this pandemic is showing what parts of the system are obviously unnecessary. And the example they gave is that airlines lifted their restrictions on 4-ounce liquid containers, specifically for hand sanitizer. So you're allowed to bring hand sanitizer, I think, up to 12 ounces on a plane, although you shouldn't be flying anyways. And I can see in that case, like, okay, yeah, that was probably just a stupid rule that didn't need to be there in the first place. But they were extrapolating that on just like everything. And I don't think that's fair because, I mean, you just said school's stupid, so maybe you'll disagree with this, but like, it's not that these things are unnecessary. It's that we're weighing the risk, you know? Right.
So for airlines to do that, first of all, probably required the interaction with federal law enforcement because I don't think airlines make those rules, right?
Yeah. I don't know.
I think it's the government that's trying to. They have a pretty vested stake in preventing terrorism. But what I will say is that whether it was the government or private companies or both, the way those decisions are made are by mathematicians. Actuaries make those kinds of decisions or at least make the recommendations that lead to those decisions. The way that works is you get a PhD in applied mathematics or some other mathematical field and then get paid 6 figures to sit around figuring out what is the least number of people you can kill while still earning maximum profit for a given company or maintaining operation of a given industry. They get paid well because they're kind of the man behind the curtain of the economy in many ways. And I'm certain that this decision came about not because large bottles of fluid aren't dangerous, but somebody sat around, probably a lot of mathematicians sat around and figured out what is the likelihood, worst case scenario, will more people die from terrorism if we lift this ban or the flu, and decided the flu.
Right.
It has nothing to do with whether it was a good restriction when there wasn't a global pandemic.
Thank you. You said that more articulately than I could have.
Thanks. Yeah, there is a lot of stuff that's stupid and can easily be dispensed with, but I don't know what all that is. I was reminded too, last night I was listening to a new Duncan Trussell, Joe Rogan episode, and Trussell made the point about like rioting and stuff, and as one potential outcome of large-scale societal disruptions or whatever. And it got me thinking, I don't remember how, but I started thinking about, I grew up in Florida, and as a lot of people know, Florida gets hurricanes, and hurricanes are disastrous often. The last major hurricane I experienced was Ivan. I was living around Pensacola in northwest Florida. That was 2004. And there were a lot of deaths. People in my neighborhood died. There were a lot of apartments destroyed. Apartments in my apartment complex were destroyed. Many roads were destroyed. Many roads were blocked by trees. I personally lost power for 2 weeks. The military came to town to hand out their rations because people would starve without them. Water still worked. It was freezing cold, but because there was no electricity, but water was still running. Point being, that's a fairly good analysis of like an urgent, unexpected disaster that had a couple days warning and a pretty good response from the government on a very contained scale. You have around that same time, though, Katrina in New Orleans, which was infamous for all of history for the failure on the part of the government to help in a
to act efficiently.
Yeah, in an expedient way. But one thing that's very encouraging about my experiences in Florida is that during that time, we did what you would hope in the best case scenario would happen organically, which is that we made friends with our neighbors. Our personal social circles grew as people formed bonds and helped each other with things like gas for generators, water, food. We sat around at dusk every day and played guitars with our neighbors. We actually, I would say, at least speaking for myself and probably for the others, I think I was much happier after the first day or so during that period, probably because of the sorts of things that you hear about with like, who's the author? Sebastian Junger? Mm-hmm. Was it Tribes? Was that his book?
Yeah.
Yeah, where he talks about how there's this tendency, and I might be conflating a few things, but there's a tendency for people in emergency situations and wars and disasters to be very happy compared to how they normally are. And he postulates, and I think it's well supported, that a lot of that's because people band together and are needed and need one another. And that is how communities form, and we see the deterioration of that when people get very cozy. So I mention all this to say that despite what could be an unprecedented disaster on a global scale, it's possible, if not likely, that there are a lot of positive aspects to it.
But how are we going to come together like that if we can't see each other?
Yeah, and it's also not to say, I just want to add that even though I'm putting a silver lining on this, I mean, people have died and people will continue to die. There's a lot of bad here. But yeah, it's a good point too, because what you just said, because like sitting around with the neighbors and socializing isn't feasible in this case. I mean, we may not be allowed out of our homes soon. Mm-hmm. There is the internet, assuming that basic social infrastructure is supported and maintained, things like power and internet. That's a great tool for people to come together in a way. It's certainly not the same thing as physically proximate bonding, but it's something.
Do you think we're going to switch to something like socialism?
Yeah. I was starting to wonder and try to process stuff, but I think yes.
I think we have to.
Yeah, and
I wonder if that will stick around after the virus.
Yeah, I'm going to read that message I sent you yesterday morning when I predicted some potential outcomes here.
Oh yeah, you should. That was.
So.
I wish you read it in reverse order than what you sent it to me.
No. I'm going to read it in the order I sent it.
All right.
And everybody just pick the part that sounds best to you.
We're getting the good news first, basically.
Prediction 1, coronavirus will turn out to be approximately as deadly as the flu. I'll just footnote here and say that I no longer think that 24 hours later. I think that's not likely. 2, the global economy will take decades to recover. 3, legislation will be introduced attempting to regulate media outlets for their irresponsibility. Ideally, 1, this will lead to a quasi-technocracy. 2, UBI, universal basic income, will be implemented. Incidentally, I think there are checks in the mail already to every single American citizen. 3, free healthcare will be implemented. Not ideally, 1, free speech will be severely restricted as fascism returns. 2, media outlets will be socialized as state propaganda machines. And 3, a second American Civil War will trigger a third World War. And I know that may sound crazy to some of you. It may sound a little too plausible to others. I'm not saying that I necessarily think either the first set of 3 or either of the 2 alternate other sets of 3 will definitely happen. But I think that what we're seeing is, I would be surprised if we make it out of this without a fundamental transformation of what modern society is.
Yeah.
And
I agree with that.
And, masses tend to love extremes. And it could lead to a Star Trek future utopia technocracy of socialism and shared resources and bonding, or it could lead to fascism and World War. Because
do you remember in 2016 when Trump got elected, and then like the year was over, and everyone was like, "Man, what a dumpster fire 2016 was. It sucked." And then we went through 2017, and everyone was like, "Ugh, 2017 is even worse. Couldn't get any worse than that. Oh, fucking 2018, so bad." It just keeps getting worse and worse, and now this, and so yeah, I can totally see it not getting better.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say, and I think that it's easy to get lost in the rabbit hole of speculation. I certainly won't discourage speculation. I think people should speculate. It's fine. But what I'll also say is that, like, it's easy to waste your time and resources and potentially damage your mental health without actually having achieved anything. Because, thinking pragmatically is much more important than accurately predicting what's going to happen in a year or 10 years. And I mean, I had to keep reminding myself of that, because I'd find myself, like, I'd go try to compile a list of us for, like, water containers and dried food and things like that. And an hour later, I'd find myself reading a Special Forces field manual on small tactics assault operations. And I'm like, all right.
Yeah, Kevin gets really deep in the weeds with this sort of thing. I'm just like, can we just like buy some tuna and rice?
I'm like a closet prepper, because like I don't actually. Just in the last few years, mostly, I've been really curious about, like, I don't know if prepping is actually prepping. Yeah, because I mean, I find it interesting, for one. I don't know if it's just like a male thing, like a testosterone thing, where guys just get distracted by things like, military operations and all that, but zombie apocalypse. But like when I moved to Portland, you told me about the impending earthquakes here, and so we started sort of building a survival list for that. And then we went to Burning Man last year, and I started reading about the best survival gear for Burning Man, and then that led me to kind of back to the earthquake list, and it turned into a bigger list. Then we had a virus list, and at this point, I'm just like basically preparing for the utter downfall of society, Yeah. Which it's fine, but it is important to prioritize, because like if you need water, that's what you need more than anything, for preferably a couple weeks, just in case. I mean, I don't see the water infrastructure breaking down, at least in the States. It could happen, though. It's good to have some on hand. You need food. There's like simple stuff that's good to get first, and then methodically think about the rest of it. But if you freak out, you're not gonna help yourself or anybody else. But I am looking at stuff like, okay, well, how does one form a government in the case of total anarchy? How does one form a militia? Home defense stuff.
I'm gonna like the idea martial law coming to my house and bringing me food, I don't know why that image really freaks me out.
Yeah, it freaks a lot of people out. Absolutely. In our case in Florida, first of all, it wasn't technically martial law. That's when the military is actually given police force in the United States. Interestingly, the military has, generally speaking, no jurisdiction in their own country. That's actually to prevent things like military dictatorships. There are exceptions, like I think the National Guard. Like I think that's their whole purpose. But what we experienced in Florida was just the military was just coming to help. They still didn't have any jurisdiction. But at a state level, in the states, when a governor declares a state of emergency, that gives the green light for the federal government to act. So you usually in states in situations where there's a local disaster like a hurricane, the president's team and the governor's team are usually in close communication to decide when to make that call. Because I don't think the president is even legally authorized to come send federal resources to help until that happens. When that happens, like when it happened in Florida, the military rolled into the largest, gathering place, the Civic Center in Pensacola, which is like where the hockey games were, where the larger concerts were. And people just started lining up to just take MREs, meals ready to eat, which are these freeze-dried, or not freeze-dried, but just, little portable meals. But anyway, the point is just that the reason they were there is because they had all these rations, because it's the military. Of course they do. And they were just sharing them because people would starve to death otherwise. But that's different than a forced quarantine, because it's one thing for the military to show up and say, hey, come to this place if you want food. That's very different from them going down your street and saying, don't leave your house.
Yeah.
So, and I think a lot of people won't quite get that difference unless they've been through these kinds of emergencies. And at the same time, that difference may be a moot point, because if the military is sent in to distribute food, the rate things are changing. It could be the same day that they're given lockdown orders. I mean,
yeah.
It's not the most meaningful distinction in the world necessarily, but...
What do you think about, that saying, like, you shouldn't give up liberty for safety?
No.
Oh.
Is that a saying?
Yeah, it's a thing people say. I think it was said a lot during, like, after 9/11 and all the stupid, like, TSA rules where you're basically getting groped and stuff like that. Yeah, I saw someone on Twitter, no one really, like, that important, but, like, just talking about, because, like, there was this hashtag, Shut It Down, Jay, and I think it was for the California governor, I want to say, and they're asking him to shut down, like, basically everything. Like, he was acting too slow. I think they just, like, shut down bars and restaurants, and they're like, no, shut down everything. And someone was saying that was ridiculous. Like, it's terrible that as Americans we're so quick to, like, give away our liberties for safety. And I think, like, I don't know what to think. Like, this is just so different. Like, as a person, like, I like liberty, I like freedom and all that. Like, I want those things, but people are gonna die, man. Like, it's a tough place to be.
Yeah, I mean, to take one step back. Fundamentally, security of any kind is always a trait of liberty. So, I mean, if you want maximum liberty for your own household, then unlock all your doors and windows and see how well you sleep at night, On the other hand, if you want
How is locking your doors giving up liberty?
It's giving up security and maximizing liberty. So if you want maximum liberty, I might have misspoken, but if you want maximum liberty, don't lock anything. Let everybody come and go as they please. If you want maximum security, lock everything to the point that you can't even leave, and now there's no liberty. It is a trade-off. So, I mean, with email, if you don't want too much security infringing on your liberty, then use password for your password, and you've got no security. It's definitely always a trade-off. It's one or the other.
I don't think just locking your doors is giving up liberty, though.
Yeah, I mean, maybe that was a dumb analogy, but laws that say you can't enter somebody's house without permission, maybe let's get rid of those because we want liberty. It's absurd. And there are very few scenarios, I think, where somebody can comfortably get away with not trading any liberty. I mean, it would take an armed compound to stay safe in that scenario, and even then, only until the government decides to step in. So yes, it is a trade-off, but and I don't mean to minimize people's concerns about trusting the government to make that trade-off in a responsible way. we do need to restrict government, and the government needs to restrict the masses. It is a mutual restriction. It's important to try and maintain the balance, and the balance cannot ever be perfect, and it's best if we keep trying through a representative democracy system like the one we have to make things better gradually over time, hopefully.
Yeah, the problem is there's just too many damn people. Like, and there's too many dummies out there to, like, let maximum liberty, be a thing, especially now.
Yeah, because public health and public safety are within the purview of the government. It's one of the reasons we need them is to prevent people from hurting each other.
Yeah, there's an article that was going around like last week where it said supposedly one woman in South Korea caused like 80% of the cases.
Really?
Yeah, because she, I think it was kind of the beginning where they didn't really realize how bad it was in South Korea, and she was like sick and, I don't know, stay inside for a bit, but then went out afterwards. And
I've seen a lot of posts about Typhoid Mary. Are you familiar with Typhoid Mary?
No.
So Typhoid Mary was a cook, I think, in New York City around 1900, and she had typhoid. And
wait, her name was Typhoid?
No, her name was Mary. She had typhoid.
Okay.
And she was isolated and ordered to stay isolated, because I think the way it worked, at least then, if not now, is I don't know if typhoid's still even a thing, but I think you had it for life. So she was like told you really should not go anywhere forever. Sorry. But she just kept going to work. Like she would sneak out of quarantine or whatever. Like, and she was a cook. So she personally led to, I think it was like 52 deaths, just from her alone. And I don't know how far it spread past that point. And, on the one hand, you generally don't want to dogpile and blame one person if they accidentally infect a bunch of people.
Right.
Typhoid Mary's an exception because she knew what she was doing and didn't seem to care. But yeah, your point though is that, like, I think what a lot of people didn't quite understand, and some people still don't understand, is that just because you think you'll do fine through the flu, it's not always about you. And you can get the flu by going out and socializing when you shouldn't, and then pass it to God knows how many other people, and they might die.
Yeah, and that person might be a doctor and treating other patients.
Yeah. I mean, it's we have a social responsibility to contain ourselves. Mm-hmm. And at this point, in a lot of places, you can still, in most places, you can still go outside. There's a lot of people getting out and walking and going to parks and such, but it's not a good idea to get near anybody or touch any surfaces. And there are some places where you are not allowed to go out to a park. There are lockdowns in place right now, where you can go out for doctor's appointments and groceries in some places. Otherwise, you're not allowed out in public. Certain essential employees, probably like hospital workers and grocery store workers, are allowed to work and maybe required in some circumstances. But California was locked down the day before yesterday. It's 40 million people. I don't know exactly the rules, but there's definitely no precedent for this, and I think that it is probably the best thing that could happen, assuming that we are able to maintain essential social and governmental fabric. And again, at this rate of change, I don't know. I mean, I'm hearing things like, I read last night that, and I don't know if this is true. I didn't actually read the article, but I saw a headline saying that mortgage payments, I think nationally, are suspended. Mortgage payments. Like, that's the airline industry earlier this week said that if they don't get $50 billion immediately, they're done. The airline industry is done. There's not a clear precedent on this scale for this. What I am curious about is things like whatever the Imperial College came up with, but for social and operational changes. I'm very curious about the mechanics of society and how those fare under various simulations. The virus, that's also good to know. But it's entirely possible that the virus is just the trigger to a much bigger problem that's approaching. Maybe not. I'm certainly not convinced either way. But I don't know, to the point of scale, there are people who specialize in this kind of thing, mostly for governments. And there are known procedures and protocols and expected results from certain types of emergency scenarios. We have things like FEMA, which is the Federal Emergency Management Administration, which is not perfect. They're not infallible. They fucked up Katrina pretty well, or somebody did. I don't know who to blame it on, but they still have more experience than anyone else, and they are aware of and experienced with disasters and management and expected outcomes on various levels. And I expect some of them know how it works on a national and global level based on predictions and simulations. I would like to know that, though. I don't think there are many civilians who have that information.
Yeah.
Granted, we could figure it out, but it'd be nice if there's like a back door to get like the shortcut, you know? Mm-hmm. So I'm doing a lot of research, doing a lot of prepper research, historical research, because, I mean, you can learn a lot from looking at historical disruptions and systemic revolutions and such.
Did you know we have fewer hospital beds per person than Italy?
I don't think I knew that.
Yeah, I think it's like 2 beds for every 1,000 people.
Yeah, I heard 2 point something.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. I had some weed gummies yesterday, and I wrote down some things I wanted to talk about. And there's one thing that I wrote down that I was like, what the fuck did I mean by that? I said, what happens if Kimiko gets sick? And when I read...
Kimiko's the cat.
Yeah.
We have 2 cats.
Yeah, but I don't care about the other one, apparently. So it took me a minute because my first thought was like, cats can't get the coronavirus, I don't think. But it was more like if she gets sick and I have to take her to the vet, but there's no vets.
Yeah, that's a good question. And also, I don't know that she can't get sick because this...
Dogs apparently can't get it.
Can?
Can't.
Can't, okay. So one of the things about this virus is that it is transmissible between animals and humans. I just don't know which animals. I haven't looked into that. I don't know if cats are vulnerable or not.
Well, this all supposedly came, I don't know if they confirmed this, but they think it came from wet markets out of Wuhan. And for people who don't know, wet markets are basically these markets where they just they butcher animals, and there really isn't a lot of good hygiene practices. It's just like a lot of fluids mixing together. I
heard Sam Harris making the point that like that has to go, that needs to come to an end, and he thinks, and I agree, it would be pretty hard to make a case that you have to spend some time handling a bat in one hand and a duck in the other hand. That's how he put it.
Right.
Like nobody needs to do that.
Right. Exactly.
But to be fair, I don't actually know that that's true because I mean, this could be a privilege thing. Like I don't know what the conditions are in Wuhan, but I know that there are places in the world where there are actually bigger problems than sanitation because people die of starvation every day. Mm-hmm. So that's not to say that that's a whole different thing. But anyway, go on.
Yeah. No, I just wanted to say that. So it sounds to me that it probably came from just the mixing of fluids of butchered animals. I don't know.
People are saying somebody ate a bat, and that's why. I mean,
I think that's what they were saying a while ago, and now they don't think it was kind of a meme going around. But
yeah,
I don't know. Obviously, I should have researched that a little better.
I do want to say one thing. There has been what appears from my admittedly subjective angle to be a considerable effort on the part of President Donald Trump to God, almost threw up saying that to rename or restyle the virus, the Chinese virus. He appears to be going out of his way. I saw a screenshot.
That's what we need on top of all this, a bunch of xenophobia.
Yes, right.
Great.
I saw a photograph. I don't know. I didn't check the sources. It looked like it was accurate, but it was a photograph of one of his recent speeches where he had, with a pen, he had crossed out the word corona and written Chinese in all caps. He's going out of his way to frame this as a Chinese virus. And it's not just offensive in the abstract. I personally know people being harassed because they're Asian. The president is a dangerous bully and a buffoon, and he is continuously, unabashedly empowering bigots to do what bigots do. And it's disgusting. And
well, that brings up another question. How do you think this is going to affect our election? Do you think Trump has a better chance, a worse chance? I mean, I think he's handling this terribly, but I don't think he handles anything well, and that didn't stop him from being elected in the first place. So
right, and there's another phenomenon to be aware of that you and I have discussed, which is during times of crisis, people are more likely to re-elect whoever the current leaders are. Mm-hmm. So they're afraid of change, or because they view the leaders more sympathetically.
On the other hand, people are talking about universal health care more than ever. Like, people are starting to think like we need to like implement some more, some type of socialism.
Yeah,
and Bernie's the guy for that. So I think he has a much better chance than he did, a couple weeks ago.
For sure, and I also think that like right now the government actions that are underway, things like bailouts, which are if not already signed, are certainly making their way through. Bailouts, checks to every citizen, free, to some extent, free healthcare, free treatment for specific cases. All of this is, I think, we are currently the most socialist we've ever been as of like 3 days ago. And it's interesting that it's a Republican government that's in place when that happens. And it's telling that it would take an actual, potentially civilization-ending disaster, and I don't think that's an overstatement to say that it's potential, to get there. And, it's a question of whether that's just a blip, like TARP was a blip when Bush was ceding power to Obama in 2008, the Troubled Asset Relief Program following the 2008 stock market collapse, which was temporary and paid back with interest, and the government stepped out of the bailout at that point. I mean, it could be that kind of thing, or it could be, an actual shift to socialism that's permanent. Don't know.
What good do you see coming from this? Let's end on a positive.
Well, there's potentially a lot of good coming from this. I mean, like when I just read that note about my potential predictions, a technocracy or a quasi-technocracy, which is a government that's largely run by scientists and technically savvy people, not only scientists, because it takes more than just being a scientist to run a government, of course. But I think a shift towards more respect for science and knowledge and high quality information and analysis could happen. That would be excellent. I think that UBI is probably a good thing if it comes out of this. Universal healthcare could come out of this. There's potentially a lot of grand good on a smaller scale. If this goes anything like the last hurricane I experienced, there's tons of good there because it increased bonds, it increased community awareness. I made a lot more friends during that period with people who I probably wouldn't have occurred to me to even talk to at the time. Became pretty close. And then that also has stuck with me. Like I'm not going to ever forget that. And if that happens for other people as well, that'll go a long way because our current state of society, barring all this recent stuff, is fairly cynical and detached and apathetic. And that's unfortunate. And it's possible that people could actually become more emotionally open, vulnerable, and appreciative of one another through this kind of scenario. So yeah, I think there's a lot of potential good. Yeah.
I see everyone kind of going through a bit of an existential crisis and reevaluating their own lives and the possibilities of like how we can live and survive as a species. And I think it's going to be really hard. Like I think it is a crisis and it will continue to be, but a lot of times, out of those flames come something.
The phoenix.
Yeah, the phoenix. Yeah, there you go. Thank you. Finished my analogy. Yeah.
Right. So I think that's a fairly positive note. It is a serious situation. It just without throwing a bunch more word salad onto it, I will say that if I just kind of close my eyes and see how I feel overall, I expect a positive shift.
That's good.
Yeah,
you're very doomsday, so that's nice to hear.
Yeah, I'm a paranoid dude. Like the first thing I did was bought a gun and whiskey and amphetamines, legal amphetamines, because I have ADD. But yeah, that was the first thing I thought. I was like, all right, I need a gun, I need some booze. And,
that was a funny day. We went out, we got a gun, whiskey, and amphetamines.
Yeah, it's good times. and you know, and this is coming from a guy who's like routinely speculating about what will cause the end of the world and how will I help to repair it after the fact, and how quickly do I need to form things like militias and such. It's a somewhat dour and serious perspective that I have, and I am not any more concerned now than I was then. So that's a good thing, in case that wasn't obvious from that description. So.
And also, Kevin and I will be home a lot more often, so we can update standard deviation every week.
Yeah, if you guys...
I don't think we have an excuse anymore.
No, I would agree. And if you guys want to send us listener questions, we always ask for them and we always mean it. But I mean, especially now, this is a really great time to engage, whether it's about the virus or anything else. I mean, I think we all have a little more time than we anticipated. So let's do this.
Yeah.
All right, check out standardpodcast.com. Tell your friends, tell your family.
All right, thanks, guys. Stay inside.
Bye.
Bye.